Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention that we will have plenty of time for questions at the end of tonight's program. If you want to go ahead and locate your Q&A button, it should be at the bottom of your screen if you're on the computer. It might be towards the top if you are on a tablet or mobile device. So at any point during the program, please feel free to go ahead and use that Q&A function, and we will get to as many questions as we possibly can at the end of the program. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Mary Pat.
Thanks so much, Annie. Good evening, everyone. As Annie said, I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our second annual Mittelman-Berman Holocaust Education Series program. I'd like to start by thanking our community partners for this program. We sincerely appreciate your ongoing support of the museum. Congregation Shereth Israel, Faith Forward Dallas at Thanksgiving Square, Legacy Senior Communities, Southwest Jewish Conference, Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission, and World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. I'd also like to give a warm welcome to our museum members and our board members joining us tonight. Thank you so much for all you do to support the museum. We could not put on programs like this without you. And of course, I'd like to thank our generous supporters of the Mittelman-Berman Holocaust Education Series, Julie Mittal Berman and Dr. Joseph M. Berman. Julie and Joe, we are so grateful for your support of the museum in this program. I'd now like to invite Julie and Joe to say a few words about this series.
Thank you, Mary Pat. Thank you all for joining us tonight. It's our great pleasure to be able to support the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum by creating the Mittelman-Berman Holocaust Education Series in memory of my parents, Magda and Laszlo Mittelman. Both of them survived Auschwitz and labor camps and the resistance. We created this series to ensure ongoing education and knowledge of the Holocaust for future generations so that the unthinkable can never, ever happen again. We're so happy to be able to have Dr. Grabowski as our distinguished speaker tonight. With the disturbing Holocaust and history revisionism on the rise today, his subject tonight is very timely. Thank you also to the museum staff for putting together tonight's program. Joe?
I just want to thank Dr. Grabowski, Professor Grabowski, for taking the slings and arrows of a Holocaust researcher these days, both in Poland and around the world, where the Holocaust is being quickly, unfortunately, being forgotten. And it's his research and men and women like him who are keeping the Holocaust memory alive, keeping the truth alive, keeping the information valid. I think this is a very important research project, and I appreciate all his efforts and recognize the unfortunate trouble that he's having to tolerate in Poland with all of this. But thank you so much, Professor Grabowski.
Julie and Joe, thank you again for your generosity and your commitment to Holocaust education. We're so grateful. Tonight, we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Jan Garbowsky. Dr. Grabowski is a professor of history at the University of Ottawa and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. His interests focus on the Holocaust in Poland, and more specifically on the relations between Jews and Poles during the war. Dr. Grabowski's book, Hunt for the Jews, Betrayal and Murder in German-Occupied Poland, was awarded the Yad Vashem International Book Prize for 2014. His most recent book, On Duty, the role of the Polish Blue Police in the Holocaust was published in Poland in March 2020. We're in for a very interesting conversation tonight. Just this month, a Polish court ordered Dr. Grabowski and fellow historian Barbara Engelking to apologize for saying a Polish village mayor collaborated with the Nazis during World War II in their scholarly work, Night Without End. They are appealing the decision. Cases such as this one can have a devastating impact on Holocaust scholarship. Before I bring Dr. Grabowski up, I wanted to remind you that we will have time for questions at the end of tonight's program. As Annie mentioned, please use the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen to type and submit your questions. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Jan Garbowsky.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for this invitation. Thank you for your kind words. Thanks to Julia and Joe Berman for their kind words as well, for all of you who, let's say, decided to join me today in the evening. Actually, I am speaking from Warsaw, so it's practically morning here, or slowly getting to being morning. In any case, it won't be a very long lecture, but one that is, as you heard already, might have implications on all of us who care about history of the Holocaust, about Holocaust education, about memory of and testimony of survivors, because things are unfortunately in flux. Things do change. Now, I must tell you also that I would have preferred actually not to have to speak up today. I would prefer things to be, let's say, left quietly alone. However, given the political pressures and political situation, it is impossible to remain silent. Now, oftentimes, well, historian, as you know, is being a historian is I would say should be and was normally a very quiet profession. For people like me, our natural habitat, our natural area where we live are the archives, the documents, sometimes meeting, in my case, survivors, witnesses. But being in the media, being in the center of extraordinary, I would say, attention is something that neither I nor my colleagues have been trained for. So you have to indulge me if I stumble from time to time. Many times my colleagues, historians of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, who work, for instance, in France or in Belgium or in Canada, they tell me that it's so actually that they would like to have this kind of exposure that I have. People in Poland, they say, visibly are concerned, they care, they read what I write. Well, I would eagerly trade my current position with them, I can assure them, because it is not interest, it is not passion for history that is at the core of this interest. It is a very vicious form of rewriting of history of the Holocaust, rewriting of history generally that occurs in many countries, but the rewriting of history of the Holocaust is a particular domain of countries in Eastern Europe, and they rewrite this history for a variety of different reasons. The Hungarians do it for different reasons, and the Poles do it for different reasons. The Ukrainians have other motivations, and Lithuanians have slightly similar to Ukrainian motivations, but they sort of start, the states, these countries, these states, they start to copy from their own books how to basically enforce a required national narrative that would somehow fit their beliefs, that would, in other words, diffuse or domesticate the history of the Shoah. I'll tell you more in a moment, but let me start with sharing few of of slides that I prepared just to start us off here. Well, I will start with just few pictures about slides. This one actually is from 2 years ago, from the main channel of Polish state TV, it refers under the title of Festival of Anti-Polish Lies. I mean, this is a broadcast which is being listened to and watched in millions of Polish households. Festival of Anti-Polish Lies refers to a very scientific academic conference held 2 years ago at one of the most prestigious French universities, the Haute École en Études en Sciences Sociales, which was devoted basically to the history of the Holocaust in Poland. The conference raised extraordinary ire, extraordinary we can say fury among the Polish nationalists who are in power and have been for the last several years. The conference has been disrupted. We had a crowd of people, some of them coming from Poland, some of them mobilized by Polish media, and disrupting the conference. My French colleagues never saw it. It was not even the beginning, but if you see here, yours truly, these are the faces displayed on the evening news in Poland. On the right, you can see my friend, Professor Jan Garbowsky, professor of history at Princeton, who is being here designated as a publicist. In any case, when you see your face in the context of falsifiers of Polish history, festival of anti-Polish lies, it is not good, believe me. The main pro-government weeklies caught lying, that's how they falsify history. It's not that I complain, it's part of life. However, one has to understand that words have a meaning, that words carry certain threats as well, that words can become, can incite to violence as well. Another pro-government weekly, right-wing, but very much mainstream, referring to my last book, that has been just mentioned, On Duty, about Polish blue police during the war and their role in the Holocaust. The title goes Lie Without Punishment. If you see your own face in this context, well, it implies that a punishment is needed. You know, not to go any further. All of this within a span of 1 year or so. Once again, you can see Jan Garbowsky, professor of history at Princeton, and myself with a subtitle that we blame Poles for the Holocaust. Now, the problem here is that in Poland, this history of the Holocaust has become this button which releases indeed fury of the authorities and to an extent of a certain part of the Polish society, thinking about most problematic parts of your own past is sometimes a very painful and unwelcome exercise. And the reactions, especially if they are fostered by and encouraged by the machinery, by the institutions of the state, this can indeed be very, very unpleasant. Now, in Poland, we do have a number of institutions which have been created by the state in order to enforce a national historical narrative. Institutions which have been weaponized with quite a substantial amount of money in order, and hiring hundreds of historians in order to produce history which would be palatable to the authorities, which would protect certain legends and myths, which I will mention in a moment. Now, not surprisingly, so you have here the Institute of National Remembrance, about which I will say a few words in a moment. You have things like Pilecki Institute, a smaller outfit active in Berlin, and now trying to open their booth in New York City. But turning to the Institute of National Remembrance, we are dealing with a worldwide unique institution in terms of mandate and size. It is an institution on the one hand that is supposed to educate, to do research. It is also an investigative institution with many prosecutors, state prosecutors on its staff. So it combines these roles. Weaponized by the Polish state to the tune of 120 million US dollars each and every year, it has become a powerful tool of, I would call it, memory control, publishing books, sending exhibitions, training teachers, having extraordinary impact on the life of researchers, also of researchers such as myself, who have become let's say, targets of very, very intense and very brutal campaigns of sorts. Now, before I return to my own lecture, just to tell you that the picture that you see here is a gentleman, doctor of history, Mr. Greniu, who has been appointed 3 weeks ago the chief of IPN in southwestern Poland. He is an ex-neo-Nazi, a fascist. And his appointment has been withdrawn yesterday, under tremendous international pressure. It took them several weeks actually to remove him from the position to which he has been appointed just 2 weeks before. But the problem is that this is not an accident. What happened in Poland over the last years is so this is the new face of the Institute of National Remembrance. These are the people, or this is the fellow who somehow symbolizes a very, very unpleasant shift, a very unpleasant shift from let's say, center to right wing to extraordinary right-wing situation. What happened over the years is that anti-communism started to trump anti-Semitism. And I will expand on it in a little moment more. So there is a huge malaise in Poland with history, and at the core of it is, I would call it, inability of coming to terms with own past. And at the center of this problem is the history of the Holocaust. Why? Well, the problem is that indeed, as all historians, let's say respected historians would agree, each and every nation has its portion of blame to carry for what happened during the Holocaust. Obviously, the project, the execution were German. However, can anyone in Europe say that no other nation took part, or no elements, segments of other nations took part in this tragedy, in this catastrophe? No. The French, the Italians, the Belgians, the Dutch, the Poles, the Hungarians. I mean, you can march across Europe and you will see that segments of occupied, even not allied, but occupied societies did their bit, somehow made their own, sometimes modest contribution, sometimes not so modest contribution to the tragedy of the Jewish people. Now, the Polish case is very, very, of course, unusual. Unusual for a variety of reasons, one of which is that Holocaust geographically happened in Poland. So 5 million European Jews have been brought to within the geographic borders of pre-war Poland and murdered in the extermination sites. So Poland has become, as a country, also a very reluctant custodian of the memory of the extermination, because extermination sites, starting with Auschwitz all the way through Bełżec, Treblinka, Sobibór, Majdanek, Kulmhof, all of them are in today's Poland. So, so they are German creation, of course, but they have been located in Poland. The second thing is that one in two, 50% of the victims of the Holocaust were Polish Jews. So 1 in 2 were Polish Jews, and all of this somehow makes this Polish case very peculiar, very different. Now, one has also to remember that Poland, as non-Jewish Poles, as a group, as a nation, were, of course, victims of ferocious Nazi terror. However, the problem is that in many instances, people who were victims of German terror also victimized the most fragile, the most vulnerable people, namely their own Jewish neighbors. This has been richly documented, and exactly this kind of research is the research that triggers extraordinary fury on the part of governing nationalists, on the part of institutions and organizations that they control, that they finance. So what do they want, these nationalists, as I call them, although one could employ much stronger words? What do they really want? Well, what they want is to protect a series of national myths, legends, upon which much of Polish nationalism has been built, or around which much of it has been built. For instance, the primary one is the myth of national Polish innocence. So we, as a Polish society, we held this moral high ground. We did the right thing. We were the victims of Nazi terror, and we have nothing to apologize for. Now, the people who are running the so-called history policy of the Polish state, they are not Holocaust deniers. They don't deny that the Holocaust happened. What they do, however, is they say, well, Holocaust happened, it was purely German affair, and our people, our nation, had nothing to do with it. Okay, this is the essence of so-called Holocaust distortion. It's not any longer Holocaust denial. Holocaust denial nowadays is let's say, a fringe phenomenon that is a domain of very few and without major influence. It's, however harmful it might be, and it is, it has been relegated onto the margins of discourse. What replaced it and increasingly moves into the mainstream is Holocaust distortion. So the people on this nationalistic side, what they will tell you, of course, Holocaust happened, the Jews suffered, the Poles suffered, the Ukrainians suffered, depending on Lithuanians suffered, but they say that if some people, they will say some Poles harmed the Jews. But, you know, in every and each society, you have a criminal margin, and this is exactly what they were. They were a criminal margin, you know, bad people, criminals who did bad things to Jews. But doing bad things to Jews, they argue, these people removed themselves beyond our national community. So this is this rosy picture of the past, Polish society rescuing the Jews. Actually, if you look at the website of the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of this notorious Institute of National Remembrance, on the website of the Pilecki Institute, what you will find, it will be a general stress of Polish righteous, of Poles who saved the Jews. And indeed, these extraordinary, courageous people need to be celebrated. However, in this case, they are placed as a default position of the Polish society. So in other words, whenever you want to say about something, about, let's say, Polish anti-Semitism, about the involvement of segments of Polish society in the Holocaust, you will be countered with, but we, Poles, have the largest number of olive trees in the gardens of Yad Vashem, which is true, by the way. but which has nothing to do with the default position of the Polish nation. And it's not, it's enough to study the testimonies of the survivors of the Holocaust, to study the research, overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Now, the following parts of this nationalistic narrative is that, well, the Jews are also not entirely not to be blamed. And here you will hear voices raised about the Jewish councils, which collaborated with the Germans, or about the Jewish police, which sent their own people to death. These are the attempts. Perhaps I can find one more screen to share here with you, if you will give me here a moment of your time. Yes. This is actually an interesting screen of a communiqué issued 2 years ago by this Institute of National Remembrance. And this actually, this communiqué is an attempt to make reference to the death of Emanuel Ringelblum. Emanuel Ringelblum was one of the most celebrated historians. He was the leader of so-called Onet Shabbat in Warsaw Ghetto, keeping records and documenting the ongoing Holocaust. Now, so on March 7th, this is the anniversary of his capture in 1944. Well, the IPN issues a communiqué about the cruelty of Jewish police, quoting Ringelblum. Now, the thing is that Ringelblum died in March 1944, when the Warsaw Jewish policemen have long been dead. He actually was the victim of a very specialized unit of so-called Polish criminal police that caught him, and he was shot soon after. But this attempt to shift, let's say, the blame is quite conspicuous, to the point of seeing a Polish prime minister 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, it was at this stage 2.5 years ago, speaking in Munich about Jewish perpetrators and Polish perpetrators, placing them on the same level. Now, this, of course, is a very dangerous kind of distortion. So what happens? I don't have all that much time. I don't want to bore you too much with the details, but just to give you some background. Now, the Polish authorities, in their drive to dominate, to control history, to write national history, have a huge problem, as you have already seen, with the Holocaust. Not only because it flies in the face of national mythology, which they espouse, which their electorate, by the way, enjoys very much, because this is a sort of an easy, I would say, food, sweet but not nutritious. You can eat, but it tastes good. Our ancestors were always right. So by 2018, the nationalists in power came up with the idea that with the Holocaust, they have a problem because this particular part of Polish history, and Holocaust is, of course, also a very important part of Polish history, whether you want it or not. So they understood that they don't control it, that this is the only part of Polish history which they don't control. And actually the same applies for Lithuania, for Hungary, for Ukraine. To be honest, if anyone were to ask you, if you are not a specialist in a given area, what do you know of Hungarian history? What do you know of Ukrainian history? What do you know of Lithuanian history or Polish history? Normally, the reaction would be not very much, or to be honest, nothing. However, if you drop the name Holocaust and the history of Poland, Holocaust and the history of Lithuania, it will ring a bell or two, because Holocaust, as you know, has become this universal point of reference. It's also universal benchmark of evil. So that's why these governments make these frantic attempts to somehow domesticate the history of the Holocaust, to turn it benign, if you will, to make it lose its teeth, to distort it in few words. So in case of Poland, what happened was in January of 2018, so exactly 3 years ago, The Polish government and Polish parliament voted a law which stipulated prison terms of up to 3 years in jail for people who, I quote, would blame Polish nation or Polish state for crimes committed by Nazi Germany. Now, this legislation created extraordinary backlash around the world. It was justly perceived as a threat to any kind of sensible research, to any kind of independent critical research into the history of the Holocaust. It was a legislation which probably, in the minds, although I'm not going to read the minds of these people, but probably it was meant as an element of to freeze the debate, to make people, to scare people away from studying issues which the nationalists did not want to see people study. So you have this tremendous wave of protests. I think it went way above anything the Polish government, the Polish authorities were already prepared to face. The United States protested throughout this period. Israel raised its voice. Western European nations also stressed this, the problem they had with this legislation. So under this tremendous pressure, it took them 5 months, but at the end of June of 2018, at the end of June of 2018, the Polish government backed down. The Polish Prime Minister, one Mr. Morawiecki, met with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, and they issued a joint declaration. A joint declaration at the end of June of 2018, which took away these criminal provisions. So no longer 3 years for educators, researchers, and historians. However, it maintained the civil provisions of the same law. In other words, it meant that Morawiecki said, we are not going to introduce criminal charges against people who slander, as he said, the good name of the Polish nation. However, we are leaving to ourselves all tools necessary to make these people suffer. And then he said that we have the tools based in the civil litigation, which will be pursued against slanders of the good name of the Polish nation with the help of NGOs. And this actually was a new kind of situation. This is the kind of situation that I wanted to discuss with you at this stage. So once again, let me share a screen with you and show you here a book. So here what you see is a book, and it's a book which I co-edited and co-authored, which has been published right in the middle of this fury surrounding Polish Holocaust law of 2018. So by the way, I'm happy to report that you should be able to buy this book in English very soon. I don't have the date, but definitely I was being told that very soon it will be available on American markets. So stay tuned, and it will be in English, available in English. So the book is entitled "Night Without End." Dalej jest noc in Polish. Fate of the Jews in Selected Counties of Occupied Poland. Now, this is in a way a continuation, methodologically speaking, continuation of my previous work that I published in 2013 under the title of Hunt for the Jews. I was looking at one county of occupied Poland. What happened? The question was, what happened to Jews who fled liquidations? Who tried to survive on so-called Aryan side, who were not delivered to the centers of extermination in Bełżec or Sobibór or Treblinka, but about hundreds of thousands of Polish Jews who fled these ghettos and tried to survive outside among non-Jewish Poles, among the so-called Aryan society. And the problem is, and we know it very well, that very few managed to survive. If you look at the numbers, they are pretty shocking. I mean, in terms of Polish Jews who stayed under the Nazi boot, not those who fled to the Soviet Union. There were about 300,000 who fled into the Soviet Union, and they never encountered, let's say, Nazi terror themselves. And most of them survived. However, out of 3 million Polish Jews who had the misfortune of finding themselves under Nazi occupation, perhaps around 30,000 survived, which means 1%. So it gives you an idea of the efficiency of this German killing machine, but it's not only the German killing machine. So in my work, I tried to look at one county to see what happened to these refugees, to the Jews who tried to flee, who found refuge among Polish farmers in Polish cities, in towns, or simply who went into the forest in a way, or who tried to survive, as we call it, on the surface. People who could speak Polish without a Jewish accent, who had so-called good Aryan looks, good documents, who pretended to be Poles. Now, the conclusions of my work were very pessimistic. The large majority of these Jews in the little county that I studied were murdered with direct, which is murder, or indirect, which is denunciation, involvement of their Polish neighbors. Now, the book was was well received by scholars. It was not well received at all by the Polish authorities. But back in 2013, Poland was still a democracy, was still a democratic country. So certain things were not done. Certain protocols were still preserved and somehow accepted. Now, the major accusation or problem was that how much you can infer from one county. Can you do any generalizations? Well, I agreed one should not carry it too far, and therefore I and my colleague, Professor Engelking, we organized a group of scholars, young and older, and we tried to extend this inquiry into 9 other counties. So, well, once you move into 10 counties altogether, perhaps you can start to, that was my thinking, you can start certain generalizations. And the book that you see in front of you, Night Without End, a result of 6 years of labor in three continents, in countless archives of 9 historians working together for many, many years, that was delivered to the Polish market exactly as I mentioned in the middle of this Polish Holocaust law nonsense, with a tension, extraordinary international tension, and suddenly historians of the Holocaust emerged from their obscurity, in which to be honest, I would prefer very much to remain, and found their way to the headlines and to the news in a way that you have seen, especially in Poland, in a way that you have seen on the slides which I showed you. Well, so what are very quickly our major conclusions which triggered all this, what I will tell you about in a moment more. So basically we found that we were looking at Jewish survivors and non-survivors. Our focus was not the Polish non-Jewish society. We wanted to find out what happened to the Jews, but finding out finding out what happened to the Jews meant that we had to study as well the attitudes of the Polish society. One of these conclusions, which we could document in a quantitative way, touching numbers, percentages, was that vast majority of these Jews across these counties died or were denounced or murdered by their fellow non-Jewish fellow citizens. Another thing that we could not but note was the participation of certain organizations and institutions which have not been really studied before, such as, for instance, voluntary Polish firefighters who took part in brutal liquidations of the ghettos. The Polish Blue Police that I mentioned before, the masses of simple citizens, Poles who took part in a robbery in denunciation. So all of these things we were able to richly document, and all of these things were completely unacceptable from the point of view of Polish nationalists. And here we come to the lawsuit that probably you heard something about, that I'm involved in, and I want to use the remaining part of my discussion to tell you about this situation. So what you see right now is basically since 2019, so 1 year after the publication of our book, I and the other authors, we learned that a lawsuit has been launched in Warsaw District Court against Barbara Engelking and against me, for slander, for having slandered the memory of a Polish village mayor who has been described as someone who denounced the Jews into the hands of the Germans, and the Germans later on killed these Jews. Now, according to the lawsuit, it was not true. In reality, the lawsuit said this village mayor from an obscure village in eastern Poland was not only innocent, but he actually helped the Jews. So this was the lawsuit. Now, of course, each and every historian has to be able to confront legal action. If you write about recent history, you can step on people's toes, and this is obvious. Now, what made this trial immediately different from anything that we anticipated was exactly what Prime Minister Morawiecki announced in June of 2018 in his speech, that the government has now the tools, and he said, using NGOs to go after people who slander, as he said, the good name of the Polish nation. Now, in this case, as we learned very quickly, the lawsuit has been orchestrated from beginning to the end and financed and publicized by an organization. We call them GONGOs. GONGOs is government-sponsored NGO. So the GONGO in question was something called the Fortress of Defense of the Good Name of Polish Nation, a very burlesque-like title, but nothing funny to them. An organization richly funded by the Polish government, serving in this case as a proxy for the Polish authorities. Now, what they did actually in this stage is to research our book, to hire researchers who would look at footnotes and look for a smoking gun, look for a point that they could attack. And they thought they had one, actually. They thought they had one in the case of this village mayor. Now, the problem is that they did not know very well historical methodology. And this case, which was, by the way, the case of this village village mayor, was 2 paragraphs in 1,700-page long book in 2 volumes of it. It was a side element, a small note, and actually the author of that particular part, my colleague Professor Engelking, decided to put her trust in a Jewish testimony that we historians tend to believe in very strongly. In history, we do have certain let's say, measures where we can assign historical value to historical sources. So the lawsuit claimed that the village elder was innocent of the crimes or that he has been accused of, because there was a court trial after the war in Poland. And indeed, this court trial has been mentioned by my co-author, Professor Engelking, in her book, in her part of the book. However, we also know that these post-war trials, you have to know how to read these files. In these cases, I call them orphan trials, trials which the authorities were not really interested in pursuing, trials against Poles accused of having harmed the Jews. Usually you had village community coming together and defending one of their own. And this is what happened clearly here. And as a historian, I know how to interpret these sources. So you have two kinds of testimony. You have a Jewish testimony, you have a Jewish witness, and she says once she left Poland, once she was in the West, she says that that this village elder was guilty of this particular crime. And then you have a set of documents from post-war Polish court when the community came together, and some of them were beaten up even in order to present a common narrative. So different kinds of sources, and here we have finally the sentence. We have the sentence which was and is extraordinarily problematic. I'm sorry, once again. Well, what happens here is that the judge decided in this case to not to assign any damages because the plaintiffs asked for extraordinary high damages to the tune of $25,000 US. In Poland, it's a lot of money indeed, much more than, let's say, proportional in the States. So the judge waived this thing. Also, the lawsuit wanted to recognize certain goods, so-called national dignity, right to national dignity, right to national pride as goods that deserved legal protection. Well, the judge said no, but she said that we did not. That I was sued as an editor actually, but that we didn't have the right to write anything about this village elder because the documentary basis was contradictory. The Jewish witness said one thing, other documents said something else. So the judge entered deeply here into the core of our profession, telling us basically what is the value of Jewish testimony and what is the value of something different. And we were ordered to apologize to the lady who brought officially this lawsuit. So now, slowly summing it up, what is the situation now, what we are facing? Throughout this trial that, well, I flew 3 times from Canada to Poland to face the court over last year and so on. So in court, what was particularly interesting and intriguing and disturbing were repeated attempts to raise doubt as to the validity and worth of the Jewish testimony. We often say, what will happen to Jewish testimony? Well, the signs are that nothing good. That indeed we as scholars, educators, people who are concerned about the history of the Holocaust, we have to be extremely vigilant. If not, then with the flow of time, with the passage of time, and with the passing away of the generation of survivors, these voices can be made irrelevant. In court, we were told by the lawyers of the other side that, look, here, this Jewish woman, she is changing her CV constantly. Well, how can you trust here someone who changes her version constantly? Well, if you don't need even to be a Holocaust historian to understand that the Jews under occupation changed their CVs, that they did change their story very often, because if not, they would not have survived. Well, to give you a distant example, a distant echo of this situation, my father's original name was not Grabowski. This is Aryan papers he bought during the war in occupied Poland, because with his Jewish name, he would not really have a chance to survive. So this kind, it's not cheating, it's survival. So to put a long story here short, what we have now is a sentence, which of course we will appeal, but for the time, if should this sentence stand, then basically, in my opinion, a further critical study of history of the Holocaust in Poland will become impossible. Because at this stage, historians are being told that a huge number of Jewish testimonies, if they are confronted with documentation which we find of much lesser value. So if there is a contradictory evidence, we have no right to launch any hypothesis. So this is one part. The second thing is that the chilling effect of this trial, of this kind of legal, we can say, pursuits of historians, has already had a tremendous freezing effect on Polish scholars, on My situation is, of course, way more comfortable. I am a professor of history and a very senior one to it in Canada, although I do work most of my research I conduct in Poland. But if you think about young Polish students of history who think about writing their MAs or their PhDs in areas which are seen by the authorities now as controversial or simply hostile, then you can easily imagine where the situation is headed. Now, second thing is, in countries which want to rewrite their own history this way, they compare notes. This kind of legislation, or rather this of tactic, a lawfare, if you will, certainly will please nationalists in other countries. And generally speaking, governments like to have the tools, even if they are democracies, to control the way we think about our own past, to construe their national communities or to build them around certain ideals. So this case can have far-reaching implications. Now, as I mentioned, we shall appeal this case, and as my lawyer told me, should this case, the sentence be upheld on appeal, we will go all the way to the European Court of Justice in Strasbourg. But all of this just instead of conclusion, to tell you that we Holocaust historians have to face now a very murky future, not only in Poland, I would say, but it applies across Eastern Europe. I'm hearing very disturbing things from Russia, from Hungary, from the Ukraine, from Lithuania. So this is something that should mobilize us. And now I think I will hand it over to my gracious hosts. And if you have any questions, I will be I will be more than happy to try at least to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Grabowski. We do have lots of questions, so I'm going to do my best to get to as many as we can, and I'm going to try to group a few together that have similar themes so we can try to get to those as well. So the first question, we've had a couple of people who've asked about the impact of this distortion of history on historical institutions in Poland. So the Polin Museum, the Museum of Jewish History in Warsaw, Auschwitz, is this kind of campaign of distortion affecting those types of institutions and the content that they share?
Right. Well, the thing is that, of course, yes. These institutions are under, I mean, I am not, let's say, entitled or qualified fully to answer the question because I'm not on the inside, so to say. I can judge them by their actions. So the way these institutions behave is keep a very low profile. In terms of, some of you might have heard about this refusal on the part of authorities to renew the mandate of the former director of Polin Museum, despite all competitions won and so on and so forth. But by and large, Polish institutions of Jewish memory are trying to keep a very low profile. Although I must tell you that I was extraordinarily pleased and surprised when after the recent sentence, the director of Polin Museum, Mr. Stępiński, came out with a very, very public sign of support, which I was very appreciative, and I still very appreciate very much. So by and large, the typical way of Polish Jewish community was to hunker down and to wait for the storm to pass. And I believe that to an extent, this is a thing that they would have to do this time too.
I guess a question in a similar vein, you mentioned the director of the Polin Museum reaching out to you. Are there other organizations, individuals in Poland who are speaking out against this kind of revisionist history, or is it a fight that historians are primarily fighting? What does that look like?
Well, it actually, Poland is, let's say, Polish civil society is under attack in various let's say, areas, not only history. The courts, the system of justice have been savaged by the nationalists, by the current government. But I was encouraged, for instance, a special historical committee of the Polish Academy of Sciences. They expressed their support for us. Independent, and not the gongos, but the real local NGOs, which are still aplenty in Poland, demonstrated full support. So I have to tell you that, to be honest, I have been a professional historian since 1988, if we assume that we become professional historians once we start our PhD studies. So I have been for the last 33 years a professional historian, and I have never seen such a coming together of community of scholars in defense of history, basically. It's not that you like what Grabowski writes or Engelking writes or anyone else writes. It's the question of our basic tools being taken away and our discipline of history under tremendous pressure. So there is a huge solid movement of intellectuals' solidarity with us, for which I'm very grateful.
That's something encouraging, at least. And then we sort of one more question in the same area. Do you have a sense of the sort of the average Polish person, what they feel about this trend? Is it a split populace? Do you have a sense of what the feeling is there?
Hot from the presses, just in the evening, or which actually would be morning in Dallas, but evening in Warsaw, I just learned about a poll which has been commissioned a few days ago and published yesterday. The question was simple: what do you support? Are you in favor of putting in prison historians who write about Polish complicity in the Holocaust? Well, I have seen this on just on social media yesterday. But what was interesting, 39% responded yes to that question, and 11 said that they are not sure. Which means that 50% of Poles are either they have no clear mind or are in favor, but 39% are in favor of sending to jail people who slander. So this is actually, I was pleasantly surprised, to be honest with you. I thought that the percentage would be much higher, but the problem is that if you strike against beliefs, because in Poland and some other countries, history is not an academic pursuit, it's a form of religious experience, unfortunately. So if you attack the basis of one's religious beliefs, the reactions you receive are not logical, but they are very strong, if I may say so.
Great transition. Actually, you mentioned religious beliefs. We have another question about the position of the Polish Catholic Church today. The Polish Catholic Church, their position in regards to this kind of revisionist history.
Well, Polish Catholic Church has aligned itself fully, or as far as the hierarchy goes, fully, bishops, the episcopate, they have aligned themselves entirely with the governing nationalists. The kinds of words you can hear from Polish bishops today about these issues, but not also history, but also about minorities, about sexual minorities. Is nothing short of outrageous. I mean, I'm a Canadian. I spent more than half of my life in Canada, so I react to perhaps more strongly, because with time people become somehow, inoculated. They accept certain things as natural. I don't in this case. So the kind of language that you can encounter in Polish church regarding minority issues, regarding this issue too, is not helpful at all. Not helpful at all.
We have another question about the extent of this view being, they use the word brainchild of the current political party in power. Is that the main source, or are these views coming from other political parties in Poland as well?
Well, the problem also here is when I told you about the 50% who would like or to put in prison or don't know what to do with them, that this file I call it dignity file, national dignity file, that we have to defend our good name of our nation, is, I would say, the last point of the last area in which deeply polarized Polish society comes together. So if you look at the votes in the Polish parliament, the votes about patriots, for instance, who deserve national recognition, some of them being people involved in in anti-Semitism and in murders of Jews. You can see that the opposition usually votes together with the government, with the governing party. In best case scenario, they abstain. So this is the last, this defense of national innocence is the last area where these parties come together because they fight for Polish electorate. And unfortunately, I think it's deeply wrong and that we are all paying the price of it, but this is the current situation. And this is this area where they still see eye to eye.
We have another question that sort of with a more historical lens, just for some context, I think. Do you think that Poland was, we're talking about before the Holocaust, was predisposed to look at the Jews living in Poland as the other prior to the invasion of the Nazis, or was that something the Nazis brought with them?
Well, you know, it's, I would say that Polish society, especially in the 1930s, underwent a very strong right-wing, let's say, turn. And under the Poland, remember, before the war was a multinational society. Jews were one minority, but there was even one larger one, which were the Ukrainians. There were the Germans. It was Poles were around 60%, or only 60%. Today they are 99% of the population. So what happened is that among ethnic Poles, there was a far-reaching radicalization. Anti-Semitism, especially in the last years before the war, became a very powerful factor, resulting in exclusion of Jews from universities, professions, and so on and so forth. So when the Germans came, they had large segments of the Polish society were ready to, let's say, accept parts of the German anti-Jewish policies. And the Germans recognize it easily. I wrote an article or two about German propaganda, wartime propaganda for the Poles. And the Germans didn't mince their words. I mean, they said, the German propaganda officials said, look, the Poles hate us, but there is this window of opportunity where we can strike. And this is that the majority of Polish society actually deeply dislikes the Jews. I mean, the words used were much stronger, but so I believe that just before in the last few years before the war, these relationships between the Jews and the Poles underwent a very steady deterioration.
Thank you. Switching gears just a little bit, we have someone who's asking if you have any advice for young researchers wanting to work in Holocaust history and memory.
That's a difficult one indeed, because, you know, it's what can I say? I mean, I would never try to, at this stage, I would never try to recruit in Poland an MA or PhD student, okay? I wouldn't be able to assume responsibility for this young woman or young man. And so I'm not certain myself whether I would advise myself what to do in the future, much less anyone who chooses a new career path. I am even hesitant in, let's say, taking on new graduate students in my area in Canada. So to be honest, I would rather now sit and wait because this is the freezing atmosphere is for a reason. So I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that young people will go after these difficult topics. I don't think the nationalists can destroy history as we know it, that they can rewrite it, but not everybody can be expected to be courageous, you know, brave. And so I really don't know how to answer that question. I would love to tell you that, you know, the future looks bright, but I am not in no position to tell you right now, especially in the current circumstances. Fair
enough. We won't make you come up with an answer tonight. You let us know if you come up with one later. I'm sorry, we have so many questions. I'm just trying to get to as many as I can here. We have a couple of other questions sort of along the lines of how can we as an average person outside of Poland, non-academic, is there anything we can do to support historians, academics doing this work, to support this kind of freedom required to do that work?
Right. I had this question addressed to me before, and I'm very appreciative of it, parts of this movement of solidarity with scholars. Now, at this stage, I am represented pro bono, which is wonderful because, as you can easily gather, defamation lawsuits are one of the most expensive animals on the planet. So for the time being, I and my colleague are represented pro bono by wonderful lawyers who do it for free. But it won't last. So I think that it's not my place to do it, but I think that we, as a community of people defending the history of the Holocaust, we will need to create a fund of some kind that will be there if a scholar, be it Poland, Ukraine, or Lithuania, I don't know, or Hungary, or any other country, is in a position of being threatened. So because these things will, I am pretty certain it is not the last thing, it's not the last trial of this kind. I'm pretty certain that these little minds are now busily working around new lawsuits, how to make life of researchers really miserable. So this is one thing. And the second thing is that I mention often now that we can do is we can demonstrate our deep displeasure, if given a chance, to Polish authorities, to their delegates abroad. If you have any contacts with Polish consulates or embassies, let them know what you think about the distortion that their paymasters are involved in, and they sometimes themselves too. And then finally, I would like to have a list of institutions in Poland or in other countries that are involved, especially state-run institutions, which are involved in attacks on independent scholars on the history of the Holocaust. It's not difficult to have this list, and then we can somehow act accordingly. So these are just, few measures that came to me right away.
We have an interesting question. Looking at maybe another side of this, have you seen any benefits or any increase of awareness among kind of the younger generation of Poles as this conversation's been made more public? Is anyone learning good lessons from this fight, from this conflict?
Well, let's hope that especially young people who are now, let's say, publicly exposed to this kind of situation. But mind you, in Poland, the mainstream state-supported and state-controlled media present me and my colleagues with subtitles, falsifiers, and liars, and so on. So the message that goes out is not very nice, but there is, of course, independent news as well. So until now, actually, what happened was that Polish children in Polish schools were entirely isolated from anything of what we're speaking here. I have been working in this area for more than 20 years. Not even one line of my writings has penetrated into the school curricula. So young people who emerge from schools, they bring with them a vision of this innocent Poland that I told you about. Now, whether it will change, I hope yes, that this very public now fight about the history of the Holocaust will attract attention. So the problem is that by and large, the young generation is, I would say, very ahistorical. I think in States the same thing, and definitely in Canada, they simply don't have much interest in history. But the ones that do, I hope they can see the light at this stage. That might be a good positive outcome of this entire mess that we find ourselves now in.
We've had a couple of questions about concern for your personal safety. So I'm going to ask that question if you're comfortable answering it. Are you concerned for your personal safety when you're in?
Well, look, I can tell you that I am one of the people who are at this stage, perhaps, somehow taking advantage of the pandemic. I am wearing my mask, right? This is a requirement here in Poland. So I'm covering my face, and this gives me a measure of comfort. I'm joking a bit here. It's not that bad, but actually I had unpleasant confrontations in the street before. But if you see your face, as you have seen plastered in the media with title "Lie Without Punishment," it's not a pleasant situation. But by and large, no, I'm not fearful. So it has not. It's not that bad. It's the problem is that it, of course, can get much worse.
Well, I think we have time for one more question. I'm so sorry if we didn't get to yours. We need to let Dr. Grabowski get back to bed, though. So I guess our last question for you is what's next? What does this appeals process look like? Do you have a sense of how long it will take? I know you mentioned you're taking it possibly to Strasbourg. Do you know what that looks like for you?
Well, I was in touch with my lawyers. I don't know exactly because we still don't have written justification of the sentence. So much will ride. I'm here in Warsaw in order to help also the lawyers to write the appeal because it requires historical knowledge of these documents, of this documentation that very few people do have. Certainly, the court didn't. And how it will play out, I don't know. What was for me very disturbing was that the day after the sentence has been announced, imagine the Minister of Justice of Republic of Poland went to the national radio and said how thrilled he was that our lies have been exposed and that the verdict was the way it was. Now, I have not heard before about a Minister of Justice who would intervene into a non-final verdict before the appeals process could take its course, and in what situation it places the entire appeals process. Finally, the judges in Poland are under tremendous pressure, and if they see and they hear that their Minister of Justice is thrilled and happy with the sentence of the district court, what happens on appeal. So I am very concerned about the whole process, and everyone would be, and that's why I think that that to look for justice, increasingly so, one will have to look outside of the Polish borders. Hopefully, as long as Poland is a member of the European Union, there are other courts to which one can go. But it's a very long, very costly and painful procedure. And I would hate to see myself become, let's say, a hostage to these legal proceedings. Because remember, part of the story is to keep us away from our writing desks, keep us away from the archives. So in this way, they are successful.
Well, we want to thank you so much, Dr. Grabowski, for being with us tonight, especially in the midst of everything that's happening in your life and beyond. We will be watching and
pleasure is mine, and I thank you very much for this most kind invitation. It has been, I'm thrilled to have been in Dallas for a moment, even virtual.
I know, we hope someday you'll be able to come here in person, but we'll be following and watching along with you. Thank you again to Julie and Joe Berman for supporting this wonderful series. And everyone have a safe and pleasant evening. We'll see you next time. Good night, everybody.